So, I am really excited about our next session, everybody. There is, although if everybody has affordable, accessible housing already, we could just move on. If anybody, should we? Yeah, move forward? No? Okay, we'll stay here for a little bit then. So, when the Lanterman Coalition got together in the summertime, which is the coalition that represents all the statewide agencies that represent people with IDD, and we said, what is our priority going to be this year? What can we all say is number one? What can we put our efforts behind? And the answer was housing. And that is why we have proposals, which if you're going to the Capitol tomorrow, you will talk about our proposal. We hope that you will talk about the ARC and UCP's proposal and the Lanterman Coalition's proposal to create new, affordable, integrated housing throughout the state for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So to discuss what is happening now, what is possible for the future, what the needs are, we have an all-star lineup up here for you, and this is going to be fantastic. So I'm going to introduce everyone, and then we'll hand it over to Micaela to take it over from there. Micaela Connery has been working in disability services since she was 15. She is an award-winning social entrepreneur, published writer on inclusion, and international speaker on social impact. She is the designer, founder, and CEO of the Kelsey Group, a mixed ability, mixed income housing community where people of all abilities and backgrounds live, play, and serve together. We have Bill Pickel. Bill joined Brilliant Corners as executive director in November 2007. He has championed Brilliant Corners' growth from startup to one of California's leading supportive housing providers, serving 5,000 extremely low-income Californians in a range of innovative, scalable, supportive housing models. Libby Drake. Libby Drake is a powerful advocate here in California, in the Sacramento area, and a specialist at strategies to empower people STEP. And then we also have Melinda Coy. Melinda, at the end, has been with the Division of Housing Policy Development of the State Department of Housing and Community Development since 2005. Ms. Coy is responsible for supporting effective implementation of housing and land use laws and policies, including the review of local housing elements of the general plan and the provision of technical assistance to local governments. In addition, she is the lead staff in the department's implementation of the 2017 housing package, which if you didn't hear, it's also affordable housing has also been lately a priority for the California legislature, and there's been some proposals which I'm sure will be discussed about that. And she's one of the principal authors of the statewide housing assessment, where she focused on vulnerable populations and land use. Ms. Coy has 18 years in the housing community development field and has a bachelor's degree in geography and political science from UCLA and a master's degree in public administration from USC. Get a little conflicted there. Yeah, abrosion, or yeah, that one doesn't work as well. So we have those who are doing it on the ground, those who are involved with state implementation, those who feel the needs personally and are affected by it, and those who are finding solutions statewide. So I'm very thrilled to introduce Micaela Connery to kick us off.
I'm super excited to be here. I'm very grateful for the work of ARC of California, excited to be on their public policy committee. We could not do the work we do, whether it's visioning new solutions or implementing work on the ground without their advocacy. So it's exciting to be here. My name is Micaela Connery, and since 2014, I have been exclusively thinking about borderline obsession with housing for people with developmental disabilities, particularly in inclusive settings. And this theme of what I'm going to talk about today is based on a paper that I published in 2016 for the Joint Center for Housing Studies, as well at Harvard University, as well as about 200 plus stakeholder interviews, 9 different focus groups across the country, visits at about 20 different disability housing organizations across the country, and conversations with folks who are working on the ground and implementing and dealing with new solutions and challenges in housing every day. And I think one of the pieces that we need to start with is reimagining what's possible. In disability, we often start with a limited worldview based on, well, this is how we've always done it, or this is the funding that we have available to do what we have to do. And so let's try to start this with expanding our vision to something new is possible. And if we had fewer constraints, what could we create, and how can we overcome those constraints creatively? So the reason that my organization is called the Kelsey is because I have a cousin, Kelsey, with multiple significant disabilities. She and I grew up together, and you'll see that a lot of the concepts that I share today are informed by the idea that despite the fact that Kelsey and I have a lot of things that make us very different, actually what we want out of housing and community and relationships are really not that different. And so I think we need to continually remember to take the sort of special out of special needs housing and really generalize it and recognize that all of us kind of want the same things at the end of the day. So we're going to start with what's happening in disability housing. What do we see as some of the trends? What do we see as some of the situations we need to address? The first is some really staggering and frightening statistics, which after spending the morning on sexual assault and hate crimes, I won't spend too long on the challenging because we've been challenged already. But as you know, over 65% of individuals with disabilities live in unsustainable housing. Unsustainable meaning either with their parent or guardian, who at some point that housing has an expiration date likely, or in an institutional setting that will not be developed in the future or can't be existing into perpetuity. That number is even higher in certain areas of California where the affordable housing crisis disproportionately disenfranchises people with disabilities. The Residential Information Service Project tells the number that less than 12% of people with disabilities actually access their own home. And the stats around housing discrimination, around affordability, around employment statistics, around area median income, around homelessness, all of those are disproportionately challenging for the folks that we aim to develop housing for. And we need to constantly get those stats as you're on your legislative visits tomorrow to make sure people know when they think about affordable housing that the community of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is at that table and facing those challenges sometimes tenfold. We're at a time where I think a lot is changing. If any of you are working on the housing issue, you're probably familiar with the HCBS settings rule, and that's the first change that people talk about. But I always say including for people with disabilities, things aren't just changing for people with disabilities. The way that we experience housing, the way that we live in communities, the way that we live and work and get to and from those places, the way we think about city versus suburban living, that's changing across the board. And we have to keep up and not look at change as something that we can resist, but that it's just coming. The future's here. We see a growing trend of parent-founded communities, and we need to think about all the challenges and opportunities that comes with. So how do we harness the financial resources, the advocacy resources, the program development resources of parents and families, but also recognize the limitations that has, issues related to risk and the acceptance of risk and sort of community inclusion, issues around equity and whether we have parent-founded communities and are we only serving families and individuals who come from middle to higher incomes. And so this is a trend right now that we need to have front of mind of how we harness it, address it, and mitigate any risk that it comes with. I'm finding more and more a discussion around segmented housing approaches based on level of need. And that really frightens me. So when my cousin Kelsey was first offered housing, she was offered housing with people with her same level of need, which meant other people who were nonverbal, non-ambulatory, and needed support for basic daily functions. And so that's not how we talk about Kelsey. We see all of Kelsey's abilities, but immediately her state and then the service provider they were assigned sort of said, these are people with similar needs, that's the right housing for you. And I see some heads nodding. I think that's a trend that we're seeing across the board. And that we're saying that community-based living or integrated inclusive living, okay, we'll agree that that's right for some people. And I love CLO has in their SLS description, they talk about that SLS is not limited to people of certain levels of need. Community living is not limited to people with certain levels of need. So we need to fight against this desire to segment between less needs and greater needs, between higher functioning and medically fragile, between high income and low income, that we need to figure out how we bring all of that together. But an exciting thing that's happening is that we are in the first generation of inclusion natives. People that are young professionals today are IDEA natives. They were educated in inclusive classrooms. They grew up in inclusive programs alongside people of all abilities and backgrounds. They value diversity. It does not scare them. It excites them. And so we have a real exciting opportunity there about what's happening. And a return to city living. We're seeing lots of trends around new urbanism, live-work settings, transit-oriented development, and we'll talk later about how that, has obvious implications for our community, but has really exciting opportunities as well. But we have some challenges as well. So, as I mentioned earlier, some people say, why are you out in California? I'm originally from the East Coast. It's the most challenging housing market in the country. But I feel really strongly that if you can figure out this issue here, you can figure it out anywhere. If you can figure it out here, which we're working on right now. So in most urban markets, rents for an individual who's relying on SSI as their income is 5 to 9 times what they can afford. I was just emailing about a project in Santa Clara County, and somebody said, so a person with a disability, can we model that about between $1,500 and $2,000 a month in rent? That's doable for them, right? And so we see laughter. So the numbers that we're dealing with compared to average rents and area median incomes are really challenging when you're looking at a person who's either SSI reliant or even a person who's fully employed in a minimum wage job. It's just not possible for them to find affordable housing, and often even not possible for them to access affordable housing, which bottoms out at about 50, sometimes 30% area median income. They're even too poor for affordable housing. So that's a real challenge. No funding is the new funding. I hope that's for now, but I do think, and I think we'll probably have some solutions from HCD of maybe how that's changing, but I came at this from a perspective of, and this is not just based on California, but we need to figure out how to do more with less. Our population is growing, and our funding is at best plateauing, and in most cases decreasing. Hopefully we can change that scenario at some point, but right now we need to figure out how to address that and look for new sources of funds outside traditional government sources. It's really stuck on that. It's really worried about, oh, there we go. We have some resistance to change. So I've hosted different focus groups and had a lot of interviews, and I've had people ask questions like, well, inclusive living really is only possible for certain people, or it's too complicated to build a development where you have multiple service providers coming in and out. You need to have one service provider across all of it. Or, my child can't survive in that kind of setting. They won't be successful. And so there's some truth to that. And I always figure out, how do you address some of that resistance and address people's fears? And they're very real fears. People have been fed a reality that people with disabilities are not welcome, safe, or supported in the community. So that resistance to change is coming out of real fear. So how do we address that without catering to it, without limiting our potential to grow and change? And that links right into one of the most interesting things as we do focus groups and interviews is, unsurprisingly, and the case would be the same for if you ask my parents what they want out of my community living, is that parents prioritize things like protection, care, and safety, and individuals prioritize things around community, fun, love, enjoyment. And so those things aren't mutually exclusive, but let's acknowledge that perhaps, again, going back to parent-founded communities versus what self-advocates want, that there's some real differences there, and how do we find common ground? And we'll talk a bit more about that. And I think the reason we struggle so much to find common ground is because we've been fed a false dichotomy that inclusive settings are inherently not supportive, and very supportive settings inherently can't be inclusive. And that's not true. It's not the case, and I think there are a lot of people who work in this will know this, and we need to keep reminding this to people over and over again. This is also why California has such a wonderful opportunity. Our SLS system here really allows us to build fully community integrated inclusive settings with 100% support and 100% care and protection at the level somebody needs. And by no means is it perfect, and I'm sure SLS providers would say that there are challenges to doing that, but the structures are in place that you can do both and can have both. So let's not pretend they have to be so far away from each other. And again, I think one of the biggest challenges we have, going back to kind of the language and terms around this, is that we over-specialize the housing needs of our community. And sometimes that is just exhausting people on housing stock types and very specific elements and highly individualized. I love the idea of individualization, and I think that's really key. When it comes to actually the housing stock and building that, we need to come up with some general terms and speak in a language that doesn't frighten people when they think about all the kinds of stuff they have developing. We also need to not frighten people in terms of what it means to have people with disabilities in their community. So I recently sat in on a conference where somebody talked about the real challenges of being a parent of an individual with disability, and all of the behavior challenges that their child faced and all of the struggles that they face every day. if I'm going out and trying to talk to people about the importance of community-based living and including people in their communities, that's not a narrative that is helpful, nor is it, I think, fair to a person with a disability. If somebody talked about all of the worst categories of me every day, nobody would ever want to develop housing for me, nor would they want to live with me. And so we need to recognize that while there are real challenges and we can mitigate those and address those, we don't need to focus on those right off the bat. We can address them, and I'm not saying be Pollyanna about this. There are real challenges we need to overcome, but let's not lead with that because I'm not sure who that benefits in the end. I think there's also a really concerning on a challenge, the lack of understanding around disability issues among housing developers, and I'm sure, Bill, you can speak to this a little bit more, but often I hear language around, oh, well, people with disabilities, we have a few people who use wheelchairs, or, you know, somebody even said to me recently, we have like basically everyone who lives in our SRO has some sort of mental issue. We have a lot of discussion around diversity and inclusion where disability is left completely out of the laundry list of areas of diversity. And so there's just not an awareness about what our community is, who we are, what we offer, what we bring to a housing community, and what we need out of those housing communities. So on to some solutions, because I think there are, and some really exciting ones, and we'll hear more about what's being implemented today. I think we need to speak outside of our own community. So I spend about 90% of my time not speaking to people who are working in disability housing, in disability service providers, or traditional disability funding sources. We don't have the resources internally to address this problem, and we probably never will. So we need to really figure out how we speak to other communities and align with other issues and bring on new resources, and not just try to spin our wheels on the limited resources we have internally, and speak language and terms that people care about and understand and can relate to. Remembering that housing is housing and we don't need to over-specialize. So we talk in general terms around what types of units and why, or what types of housing models can work and why, but we don't need to get in the weeds of every single specific person, because that's not how we design multifamily housing. Nobody designed your apartment for you specifically. They designed it with general best practices and principles of apartment development, and we can apply that with theories of universal design and ideas around supported living without having every single apartment look different. We need to standardize it. Most exciting for me is the idea that we can take advantage of millennial consumption patterns. So remember how I talked about that generation of inclusion natives? They want to live alongside people of different abilities, interests, and backgrounds. IKEA just did a recent study on co-housing across the world, and they published it with Fast Company. It's a really interesting article. And among many of the things that they learned, one of their areas of co-housing that millennials said they wanted to see was housing with people with different backgrounds than them. Disability is part of that difference, and it's something that people crave and desire in their communities. We have millions of young people that have flocked to programs like Best Buddies and Unified Sports and Unified Theater, and you name it. They're now adults, and how do we engage them as part of our communities? And recognize that a lot of their preferences are actually not that different from the preferences of people with disabilities. So when people talk about special needs housing and they need transit-oriented, well, so does everybody else. Or sensory-friendly housing, well, guess what? In Well and Good this year, the #1 wellness housing trend, this is not a disability magazine, was sensory-friendly housing. So a lot of the trends right now are very much aligned, and a lot of the needs right now are very much aligned. So let's couple those together and leverage this community in terms of other tenants to live with us, and as other tenants to provide some form of ongoing rental support. So when we look at, we've done a bunch of different cost analysis and a very basic return on cost analysis. And when you look at an 100% disability project, assuming those SSI level incomes, there's never a way you can make that project cash flow positive. Without subsidy, there's no way you can make that work. When you start to mix those individuals in with other communities with market rate and moderate and other affordable, that scenario changes drastically. We need certain tax benefits and incentives to allow us to build these communities, because that around property tax, that becomes really challenging, and that's some of the advocacy things we're exploring right now. But if we can incentivize and support people rather than us being the set aside, let's not ask for development to include our population. Let's get market rate set asides. Let's build disability housing with a market rate set aside that we can use as ongoing operating cash flow to support inclusion in our community and to support our projects to stay afloat without as much subsidy as might traditionally be required. So let us use market rate units as a way to make our communities better and make them more financially sustainable. And map the community. And so we think a lot about speaking outside the language. Is who else has similar around modular housing, around smart living. Every time I use my Alexa, I think somebody's got to make better applications of this for a person with a disability to use to support their independent living. And so there's lots of exciting trends that if we think intentionally and map, literally we create a matrix and say, who are all the stakeholders? What are their biggest challenges? And what resource can they bring to the table of disability inclusive housing? And map it really intentionally to go after those individuals, go after those resources, and bring them in to help be a part of our solutions for new housing. And considering the balance between, rather than that false dichotomy between inclusive and supportive, looking at this Venn diagram, this is a framework that I've been creating over the last few years, really looking at the balance between care, choice, and access. It's too often the case that whether it's in historical periods, in legal cases, in program design, we pick one of these, and it's a super caring environment, but we totally undermine them in a person's choice and their access to the community by the level of care we give. Or we focus on choice, but we don't actually give them access to community, so it's not a choice at all. Or we focus on access, but we take away their ability to have the supports in those accessible settings and therefore lose care. So the right question to ask is, starting with the access question, how do we support access in the most least restrictive environment, like in education? How do we do that in a way that supports full choice of the individual to decide how they want to live their life? And then how do we layer on any of the cares and supports that individual needs to be successful in the housing that they choose to access? So you keep it in that circle and focus at that center point. And the other areas to notice that there are some challenges. So as challenging as housing is today, as soon as we address just the shortage of housing, we also need to recognize how complex this issue is. One of my most favorite ones to point out is recognizing that what a person wants out of housing when they're 22 may be different than what they want when they're 40, may be different than what they want when they're 70. I think we've created a false assumption here that people, once they get housing, check, done, moving on. And that's probably not the case. We have to ask questions about measuring quality, questions about developing new leaders in this space, questions about parent involvement and how to engage them, and issues around dual diagnosis and where behavioral health fits into all of this. I was recently at an event, and then I'll be wrapping up. Somebody said to me, the good news is that we have all of the models that we need already out there. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. And I just wanted to scream. I'm like, I think that is such a problem in our community that we continue to make tiny iterations on models that were developed in the early 1900s. And we really look detailed about how we've evolved now. We've just kind of continued to tweak the wheel. And perhaps in this community, we need to throw away the wheel at some level and really start again and say, if we could create our ideal community, what would that look like? And turn challenge into an opportunity. So it breaks my heart when I hear parents say, who will take care of my child once I die? That breaks my heart for the obvious reasons that that's such a hard question that parents are worrying about across the state and across the country. But what makes me even more sad about that is that it's forgetting that the opportunity that their children bring to a community, that who will be lucky enough to have my child as a member of their community. Because I can guarantee you, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities are people others will want as neighbors, will want as tenants, will want as community contributors. And so that's so we really have to switch the narrative and make this an exciting opportunity to develop housing for individuals who need it most. So thank you so much. Now we'll meet somebody who's actually developing the housing.
Well, thank you all, and let's give another round of applause to Micaela. That's an amazing and inspiring presentation, and I have to say, the point of view from which I'm going to present some information is very much of a sort of systems insider point of view, with a heavy emphasis on the positive role that the public sector can play in public-private partnerships. But I love all of the sort of think outside of the box energy that Micaela and so many people like her, really from the advocacy community, are bringing, and thinking of new ways to do things. Because one thing we know for sure, for all the good things that we are accomplishing together, we're barely moving the needle forward when it comes to creating the inclusive communities that we all would want to live in California and probably in other parts of the country. So I'm William Pickel. I'm the executive director of Brilliant Corners, and we were founded in the mid-2000s by a group of service provider agencies working in the core Bay Area, San Francisco, San Mateo, and Marin counties, who saw a gap in the service system, and that gap was affordable housing, community-based housing for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Our organization has been one that's been very fortunate in that we've been able to come up with some models that actually do produce results on the ground, namely community-based housing with integrated supports for a range of different folks, including many individuals transitioning out of institutional settings and people who are transitioning from homelessness, and more generally people whose housing is at risk and their well-being is at risk because their housing is at risk. So with that, I'll try to see if I've got the technology going here. So I entitled this Crisis as an Opportunity to Create an Inclusive California. So I think you've heard a little bit already about what the crisis is. I'm not armed with a lot of statistics. Everybody knows that housing in California is in a crisis mode. There are people who are working 1 or 2 jobs or multiple jobs for a family of 2, 3, or 4, and then have to commute 2 hours to be able to get to work because they cannot afford housing where they live. Anybody who is living on a fixed income is simply priced out, to use the title of, I think, an annual report that comes out of the Technical Assistance Collaborative in Boston. But there's also a real opportunity, and all of my presentation today will look back a little bit about what we've accomplished, but it's also to emphasize that I think in California we are at an inflection point, both around housing as a crisis for the state of California, particularly for vulnerable individuals and their families, but also for the developmental services sector in general. And I'll say a little bit more about what comprises that inflection point. So first, just a little bit about myself and Brilliant Corners, and I'll be really quick here. My background was in affordable housing. I got started in 1999, developing affordable senior housing in some now no longer existing HUD federal models, and then increasingly in low-income housing tax credits, which remains the #1 funding source to create multifamily affordable housing for anybody who has an affordability challenge. There are never enough of those units, but it is the engine of affordable housing production in California and nationally. So that's how I got started, and I joined Brilliant Corners a couple years after the paperwork was filed in late 2007 as their second executive director. Brilliant Corners was founded as West Bay Housing Corporation, and it was one of 3 small nonprofits that were working closely with regional centers in the Bay Area at that time on the closure of Agnew's Developmental Center, as well as on other housing projects. So we're a mission-driven, statewide supportive housing nonprofit. We did expand right around the time that I joined. We looked at our mission and we expanded to be able to serve other vulnerable populations. We left that pretty undefined, but the way that we understood it, or at least the way that I understood it, was based on what's known as supportive housing. And supportive housing is simply where housing and services come together, and that's what we chose as our tagline. So it's non-prescriptive. It doesn't include a laundry list of special needs or vulnerable populations that we will serve and another one that we won't. And it doesn't prescribe the exact models of supportive housing. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the models that we've been able to get traction in. We do approach the work from both a person-centered and a place-based supportive housing solutions modality, if you will. What do I mean by that? I mean that one of the things we learned really quickly, and we were newbies, we were coming from affordable housing and trying to figure out what the developmental services sector was all about and what it meant to live and work with people with developmental disabilities and understand what their needs and preferences are around housing. So we did embrace person-centered thinking to the best that we could internally in our company, and we have programs that develop one-on-one housing plans that become part of an IPP with individuals and other stakeholders, and then we try to implement those. But we also do what other housing companies do. We do place-based solutions. We buy housing. We renovate housing. We broker access to existing housing resources in partnerships of various kinds. So that's what I mean by person-centered and place-based supportive housing solutions. Our organization has increasingly over the past decade become recognized for innovative and scalable models across multiple sectors, and I'll say a little bit more about that. We have about 200 full-time employees now working primarily in our San Francisco and Los Angeles offices. We do have small branch offices, including one that's opening now here in Sacramento. We're at about $150 million annual budget. Huge chunks of that are just pass-through dollars that go into the capital costs of buying and renovating properties, as well as into rent subsidies that literally just pass through our organization and go out to both affordable housing providers and market rate providers. We have completed since 2008 approximately 200 licensed and unlicensed supportive housing properties that we then own and manage. We self-manage all of our own properties regardless of who our residents are. In addition to those owned properties, we have secured and have legal control over about 4,000 apartment units that are in various settings. Some of them are in affordable housing complexes. The majority of them are not. The majority are in buildings that you and I drove past as we came to this conference, and that are now just as good as a new tax credit building that took $30 million and 6 years to develop, okay, to create new affordable housing. There are existing resources in the community, and if we have the resources to buy our way into them, they can provide great solutions. And this kind of ties back to one of Micaela's points that we don't always have to overthink it. It's sort of an if you build it or if you acquire it, they will come kind of thinking process, right? There are apartments out there that would provide great housing for people if they could figure out how to access them. And access them means reasonable accommodations. It might mean waiving requirements that the landlord might otherwise impose, and it might mean a rent subsidy. So we'll talk more about that. We're serving about 5,000 residents, and we're on a pace over the next 3 years. We think we'll exceed 10,000 just based on our existing contracts and programs. And everything we do is intensively collaborative. There isn't one building or one portfolio of units that we've brokered in other people's buildings or one sort of case management services program where we're not involved with multiple public and private partners, including a high percentage of nonprofit service provider and case management partners. There are over 200 housing and service provider partners that we're working with around the state. Okay, so the rest of my presentation is divided into just a couple of different topics. The first one is really focused on place-based housing, supportive housing solutions. And I'm going to focus in particular on what the DDS system calls a community placement plan or community placement program that they do every year with all of the 21 regional centers and many housing partners, as well as many service provider partners around the state. Then I'm going to move to a little look at the more person-centered approach, which we sometimes simply call housing services. That does often involve a one-on-one element, but can have some more systemic outcomes. And we'll look at some models of systemic scalable outcomes in other systems that I think provide at least some opportunity for us to reflect on how we might learn from those other systems and what they're accomplishing. And then I'll close by looking at some of the challenges right now, as well as the opportunities, again, what I'm calling an inflection point in California for supportive housing for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So the slide you're looking at now, Supportive Housing Development Community Placement Plan Program, this is an annual process. Each of the 21 regional centers does put together a proposal that they submit to DDS, and which DDS will review and with possible changes approve. And it's a critical program. The last bullet point there is really the takeaway one. To my knowledge, it's the only funding in California's developmental services system for what they call startup costs. Everything else is funded in an hourly or monthly increment based on purchase of service for an individual. Here's an opportunity where the state can provide funding to start up a new day program, to start up an employment program, a supported employment program, or to start up a housing resource. And that can include dollars both for the housing itself, as well as for the integrated services. One of the challenges with it, obviously, is historically it's been focused, I'm guessing here, but probably 90% or higher of the resources have been focused on developing housing in the community and services in the community for individuals moving out of the developmental centers or transitioning maybe back from an out-of-state placement. So there's been very little dollars in this program available to folks who were, say, transitioning out of the family home for the first time, or were simply facing a housing crisis in the community. And the other thing I would note about this is historically, most of the housing resources developed, not all, but most have been licensed care settings. They're often state-of-the-art. They are often a very particular service program designs for folks with medical fragility, for folks with behavioral challenges. Physical accessibility needs obviously come into play, other person-centered modifications. But you don't have a lot of flexibility in the program. You haven't seen that many of those CPP dollars allocated towards unlicensed settings, or really more independent living settings where people have a key to their own front door. CPP accomplishments, which I would frame as a step on the path, even though Brilliant Corners is, I think, the largest provider of housing resources developed over the last 10 years for the folks transitioning out of the developmental centers. I don't think these models are perfect. I don't know that they're always the best possible solution that we could come up with as a community. And I think that poses a real challenge because, like every other organization, neither Brilliant Corners nor the dozens of service providers to whom we lease our homes wake up in the morning thinking about where our residents might move to be better served. It just isn't a question that gets asked. And I think that probably is something that all of us need to start doing, is really thinking about what, as Micaela said, maybe the right housing solution at one point in time may not be the right one 5 years from now for a given individual. But here are some of the accomplishments. The state is making progress to close the remaining institutions. It looks like before 2021. In doing so, it has created a new community-based statewide portfolio of many hundreds of community-based homes. And one of the things that I would say about those is that over time, those resources will be available to meet the housing needs of lots of different folks. And part of the reason for that is that every one of those properties, at least where there's a nonprofit housing developer involved, and the majority of them over the past couple of years have had a nonprofit involved, they are permanently deed restricted for Californians living with a developmental disability. That is a huge win, and while it creates the opportunity that over time the service modality may change, but the housing resource, which is always in short supply, will be there. One of the other features of the past few years in the CPP program and the resources that we've developed in these partnerships is the separation of housing and services. And every time I say that, I think it sounds like a divorce, right? You're separating service provider from housing provider. But actually, it's not divorce, it's a marriage. It's bringing together two different organizations and enabling them to focus on and get better at what they really are all about. And so Brilliant Corners doesn't have the requisite skill sets to provide services of various kinds to support individuals in their own homes. By the same token, although some of our service providers are fantastic on the housing side too, we believe that our ability to acquire, renovate, maintain, do long-term reserve budgeting, refinancing, all the legal and local compliance that we do associated with the housing, get the property tax exemptions, all of that lives in our basket and frees the service provider from having to think about those things. So I do think that that's a good model, and it's one that actually bears some thinking about when you think about even multifamily settings. How do you bring services and housing together in a way that isn't restrictive for individuals? I know that I would not like it if I was dependent upon, say, in-home supportive services, and then that in-home supportive services provider had control over my housing. The other major step forward that I think we've seen over the past ballpark decade is that the homes are beautiful. And I think this is true not only for Brilliant Corners portfolio, but for the homes that are being developed by other groups around the state. I see Chris McCann sitting in the back there. She's been probably, in my mind, the #1 champion of the housing cause that I know of in my 10 years in this sector. And Chris is doing beautiful homes as well. And these are being created all over the state with just a flat-out emphasis on residential beauty, just like we would all want. And I will share that when I started in 2007, I was thinking about our residents that would live in our homes, and at that time we didn't have any homes yet, but I was thinking about the residents that would live in our home and the type of amenities that they might like to have in addition to the person-centered modifications. But I was also thinking about staff who would be working in these homes and what it would feel like to show up at a home that you would be proud to be working in. So we're not shy about that. We have spent considerable California tax dollars to make these homes as much like a home that anyone would want to live in. And at the end of the day, there's another fringe benefit to that is neighbors who are often very nervous about what is happening in their neighborhood, and I'll just leave it at that, at the end of the day are asking us to refer our architect and our contractor to them so they can remodel their home. And that's a big win and sort of is a bridge builder in the community. Last but not least, there's a new housing capacity in the state. We're incredibly excited about Jordan and his leadership and the Lennerman Housing Coalition's advocacy around affordable housing. And at the same time, we have the housing groups have our own advocacy group that we put together over the past couple of years called the Lennerman Housing Alliance. And there's ballpark, 15 to 20 members and partners in the Lennerman Housing Alliance. There's a knowledge base about how to do supportive housing in California for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities that didn't exist 10 years ago. I think that's fair to say. What do you say, Chris? Are we a new resource? I think we're a new resource. A deep bench resource increasingly. Okay, so here's just a couple of quick pictures. This is one of the first homes that we did for folks moving out of, I want to say, that's probably either Sierra Vista or possibly folks from Sonoma, but that's down in the peninsula in San Mateo County. That home probably would be worth, I don't know, 1.5, 1.8 million now. It's just a crazy housing market there. This is also one of the first ones. This is in San Francisco. This home is for individuals who had been living in a hospital wing at San Francisco's Laguna Honda Hospital, which Brilliant Corners was able to close in partnership with Golden Gate Regional Center. And we also expanded that partnership and helped another 120 people who did not have developmental disabilities also move out of Laguna Honda Hospital back into the community. This one I don't have my notes, but this photo was taken just a couple of weeks ago at one of our most recently opened homes in Los Angeles in partnership with Westside. And this is one of our project managers with one of the residents in the home. He is 6'7", and we made modifications throughout the home in terms of all the doorway heights and everything so that he could be more comfortable in his own home. And that's the type of person-centered stuff that we're able to do through, we think, the separation of housing and services and through the partnership that we have with the state and the regional centers. So here now I'm still talking about development, and I'm still talking about the community placement program, but we're looking beyond what we've accomplished so far and the limitations of what we've been able to do so far to the future. And we're really excited. We have been advocating for many years and sharing with DDS that and other stakeholders that we really thought that as the state achieved its goal of closing the remaining developmental centers, the institutional centers, we really needed to have some type of startup funding resource available. And the program should continue, but now begin to focus on the needs of people who were living in the community already, but still had often urgent housing needs and certainly near-term and longer-term housing needs, whether they are living in an aging care home, living with aging caregivers at the family home, or simply living in unaffordable and substandard housing situations. So there's a name that's been floated. I think it's Community Resource Development Program. It's going to be really important that we all have a voice in the structure of that program, who it serves, what the funding levels are. But it is an opportunity to extend CPP and have it live on after the closure of the developmental centers. I think that there are many, many housing models that could, in theory, be funded through this and other mechanisms, all of which would be consistent with the Americans with Disabilities Act, with CMS Home and Community-Based Services Guidance, and with the demand that we hear from the community for the types of housing that are needed. Some of the priorities might be folks living with aging caregivers. We regularly get phone calls from regional centers where a care provider is going out of business. And what that means is the displacement of the individuals who lived in that home. And we can sometimes step in and preserve that asset or create a new asset for those individuals. There's some outdated settings out there. I know it's a touchy, sensitive topic, and they're often outdated because they've got such terrible funding. But there are places out there that are essentially mini nursing homes. And it looks like nobody's put a dollar into the physical plan or thought about choice and preferences for the folks living in those homes for many, many years. You've got the demographic wave of folks who are on the autism spectrum. And we constantly are in dialogue with family members that are just desperate for some type of solution. And there really isn't anything right now that is a sustainable, scalable solution. There are folks who are living with an intellectual disability who become homeless. In California, Brilliant Corners is serving thousands of formerly homeless individuals. There's no structured way for us to bring those services to individuals who have an intellectual disability and are experiencing homelessness or at risk of it. There are folks that have intellectual disabilities who are in jail or prison. And so justice-involved work is happening, criminal justice reform work, including supportive housing solutions, is happening and being scaled, but not with a focus on this sub-demographic, if you will. And there's people who are just severely rent-burdened. There are lots of models that can work. Obviously, two of the primary models would be set-asides in the low-income housing tax credit, affordable housing development pipeline. Thousands of units are built every year in California, and people with intellectual disabilities simply don't have systemic, sustained access to some portion of those units, and that is a possibility. And then small, creative projects that are outside of the low-income housing tax credit pipeline, I think, are always going to be needed. And these are opportunity sites that are out there in the existing built environment. How am I doing on time? Doing okay? Oh, 3 more minutes. Okay, I'll try to move quickly. So, moving from development to housing services, what is supportive housing services? Well, we think of housing services as anything that creates affordable community-based housing without building anything. Housing services also makes development projects sustainable and promotes long-term housing stability. So it can be combined with development activity, but it's distinct from that, okay? Lots of times, developers who wouldn't otherwise consider setting aside units for any vulnerable, extremely low-income population will do so with the right service package or other incentives in place. But the primary definition here is that housing services creates access to community-based affordable housing, and it can be service and rates without building. It often involves one-on-one housing supports. As I mentioned earlier, for Brilliant Corners, and I think lots of the other organizations like ours around the state, we can do individualized housing plans or person-centered housing plans. We are often involved in an immediate housing search and then provide relocation supports. And we provide ongoing housing retention supports that enable all of the people we serve. We have like probably 95% retention rates at 6, 12, 18 months, meaning that with the right package of supports, people don't experience ongoing housing instability. They're able to stabilize in their new housing of their own choice. We really lean into what we call landlord engagement and landlord incentive package work. Part of the way that we fulfill our mission is by convincing folks that have housing or know how to create housing that there's an opportunity here for them that will work for them. We do corporate leasing. We also enter into customized agreements that we develop with our attorneys that are essentially like a housing authority agreement, where we tell a landlord, here, we're going to manage a rent subsidy, and we're going to do some other things to make you whole in exchange for access to your unit. And we really get access. Even if someone moves on, we retain access to that unit for the next individual we're hoping to serve. We do eviction prevention, we do reasonable accommodations. Those aren't just changing the layout to make it physically accessible. Those can be reasonable accommodations around lease terms, reasonable accommodations around how much income do you have to show to be able to qualify for the unit. That also is reasonable accommodation work. And then we just do, as opposed to the one-on piece, we try to squeeze in, although we're often not funded to do it by the government, some advocacy work to create more systemic access. Challenges. Unlike veterans, unlike people experiencing homelessness, unlike an increasing percentage of individuals who have criminal justice system involvement, people living with a developmental disability don't have a rent subsidy program. this. I think rent subsidies provided at the state or local level are one of many third rails. I think the cost scares everybody. Who would get access to rent subsidies probably scares everybody. But my experience as executive director of Brilliant Corners is that we can house thousands of people who are literally been living on the streets for years, and we can do it in a matter of weeks, and we can keep them housed. And the missing piece is a rent subsidy. California's developmental services system typically pays for housing costs reactively. And I don't say this as a criticism of the wonderful folks over at DDS. They're administering what they're told to administer. Or a criticism of regional center staff either. But they know how to leap when there's an emergency. When someone is in a housing emergency, then they will maybe authorize the resources that are needed. But the system struggles to plan in advance to meet housing and other supportive service needs. Generic subsidy sources. What do I mean by that? Section 8, public housing run by HUD and the housing authorities. Privately owned and developed affordable housing. These resources are scarce. They're highly competitive. And right now, the good news is there's a tsunami of funding, not just for affordable housing in California, but for supportive housing, which means affordability with integrated supportive services. But the bad news is it ain't for all of us here in this room. Okay, it's for all these other equally deserving populations, but they've got tools to get those units created or get those units set aside for those populations that also desperately need them. So families who have a member with a developmental disability, people with a developmental disability are at a disadvantage even within the supportive housing world at this point in time, in my view. Supportive housing service is the gold standard. Scalable supportive housing services for other vulnerable populations. Brilliant Corners has had tremendous good fortune to work with some of the most creative, frankly visionary government partners. I've been doing government work for 20 years. We have a program in Los Angeles that's a program run out of Los Angeles County Department of Health Services, and they call their overall initiative Housing for Health. We administer a big part of that Housing for Health, and it's called the Flexible Housing Subsidy Pool. In about 3 years, the Flexible Housing Subsidy Pool, Brilliant Corners, has been able to secure 3,400 community-based apartment units for extremely low-income, vulnerable individuals transitioning from care settings and homelessness. I mean, just stop and think about that. That's what can happen when something is thoughtfully designed and the resources are put on the table. We're headed towards 10,000 households in that program over the next three or so years. We have a greater than 90% long-term housing retention rate. So when I'm driving in my Uber from the airport to my downtown LA office, I ask every Uber driver, what do you think about homelessness in LA County? And they all say, well, don't these people want to be out there on the streets? It's Grizzly Adams, and they came back from the Vietnam War, and they don't want to be housed. And I said, well, if that was the case, how could it be that 9.5 out of 10 individuals, when we house them, and some of these folks have been experiencing homelessness for many years, they stay housed. We're able to have a flexible array of housing resources. We've got shared housing. We've got SROs. We do. We've got a majority of 1-bedrooms. We've got studios. We've got 2-bedrooms. We've got buildings where there's on-site supportive services and buildings where the supportive services are visiting. And we've got units as far as the high desert and all the way to the coast. So that's another example of what can be done when the resources are available. Those resources that you see in the community when you fly across LA County, with the right resources from the public sector, we can access those resources for very vulnerable, extremely low-income people. And there's no reason why something similar couldn't happen in the developmental services sector. We do have other housing services programs in addition to that one, serving about another 1,000 extremely low-income people in partnership with health plans. These are managed care plans like Health Plan of San Mateo, and also we just launched a program with Inland Empire Health Plan, and that'll serve several hundred people in the first year, as well as with public agencies. So these are programs that can be designed with multiple public and private partners to serve the most vulnerable. Okay, wrapping up. Opportunities. Okay, I don't know if this one has come up at the conference so far. Through advocacy work of the Lanterman Housing Alliance and our partners at the Association of Regional Center Agencies, the new 5-year Medi-Cal waiver from CMS for California includes housing services as a waivable expense. We're waiting to see what this will look like, but we have modeled it on some best practice and guidance that came out of Washington. It doesn't include rent subsidies, but it does mean that an individual who is in a housing crisis, either immediate or near term, can get housing services, and California taxpayers won't have to grin and shoulder the whole cost. There will be federal matching dollars. So we think it's an important win for the system that housing services is now a waivable service expense in the DDS system. I'm noting that Lanterman Housing Alliance members, a number of our organizations, in addition to Brilliant Corners, implement really excellent housing services programs that can do this type of one-on-one planning. And then I list a proof of concept of a program like the Flexible Housing Subsidy Pool and similar scattered site rent subsidy and supportive housing programs. As I said, I don't think I make any friends around the state talking about rent subsidy, because everybody's going to want to wait until the feds magically increase Section 8 or something else happens, or we build our way out of the crisis. But if we were going to get more Section 8 and if we were going to build our way out of California's housing crisis, it would have already happened. And it's just getting worse. So I don't see too many other solutions. System challenges. A dedicated system can be a silo that may reinforce segregation. As we work with different sectors at Brilliant Corners, we work with public health, we work with managed care, we work with behavioral health, we work with housing authorities. A lot of them don't know from Adam when it comes to the developmental services sector. So I'm talking about the system is sort of siloed. And I think everybody in this room and the Lanterman Housing Alliance members are working to break down those silos and maybe make a stronger connection to California's affordable housing system. Person-centered funding can delay system-level resource planning. This is a pet peeve of mine, because we get the phone call when somebody should have had some type of housing resource planned 5 years ago, and we get the call when they're on the street, when they're being evicted for the 12th time. There's not the ability to plan the resources that there should be. It's more reactive at the last second based on each individual's need. As I noted already, other vulnerable populations have new resources and public support to access affordable supportive housing. You're going to read about homelessness every day. There's a reason for that. That's a good thing. But there aren't enough people who are decision makers thinking about the affordable housing crisis for people with intellectual disabilities. The housing cost fear factor, I mentioned that. Who pays for what? Who would get access to those housing resources? And then, okay, this is it. System opportunities. I think we're moving toward a system where you can see these pillars of a more inclusive California: supported living services, supported employment, supportive housing. I will note that the Lanterman Housing Alliance has got a grant from State Council on Developmental Disabilities, and we are working with the Corporation for Supportive Housing to develop a statewide housing framework. Then there's the Lanterman Coalition Advocacy. There's the changes to the CPP, where it becomes a community resource development program. There's the potential to capture the savings from the closure of the developmental centers or from any land-based revenue from sale or lease of land. Very important work that Jordan and others are leading. There's the CMS home and community-based waiver for housing services and housing supports. And then there's the fact that housing crisis is headline news and there is a tsunami of new funding, but are we at the table? I think I'll stop there. The takeaways sort of repeat some of the other things that I've already touched on. But hopefully that was helpful, a little bit of an insider system view, but I do believe that the solutions we need are going to require public-private partnership. We won't be able to do it without the public sector. So, thank you.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Drake. I am a woman with CP and on Section 8. It is very hard for me to find something that meets all my needs. I have a cat who is like my kid and helps me to be more relaxed, and because I can't find housing that allows cats or pets, I am away from him every day. Finding a house wheelchair accessible is a struggle as well. I have my own washer and dryer. I also need around-the-clock staff, even overnight. If there was a fire, they'd need to be able to get me out of the house fast. The point I'm trying to make is, with my income and my disability, it is very hard for me. I am glad to be able to have a voice and come give this talk to you today. Libby Drake has also been searching for a house or an apartment since August of 2016. We're here today to talk about the struggle is real when it comes to the people that we support not finding appropriate housing, or when they say this apartment is wheelchair accessible and accommodating. It's not. It still has a tub, so there's no roll-in shower. Trying to get a shower chair that is funded through insurance or the regional center, and then if they end up having to move within 2 years, having that redone. If they're lucky and their name gets drawn for a housing choice voucher, finding landlords that will accept the housing choice voucher is a whole issue all on its own. They meet the requirements that they only have to have a certain amount of people with the housing choice voucher, and then they won't go over that. So then they say, oh, we do take housing choice voucher, and they're on the list. However, they have absolutely no openings. Or they go, the economy is changing, we're going to raise the rent, and we're going to outsource over what the housing choice voucher allows. So now we still can't afford it. We run into these obstacles all across the Sacramento area, let alone all over California. It makes it extremely difficult for Libby to find a place where she can have her cat, where she can have her special shower chair, her special stuff that she wants, decorated the way she wants, and being part of her community. She doesn't want to be separated. She wants to be all-inclusive. She's a huge advocate and wants to be able to express that with her community. She's been meeting with, she went to the Sac City Council in January to express her difficulties and the hardship. She recently had a meeting with Sacramento Mayor Darrell Steinberg to discuss this issue as well. It's just really hard out there. One of the other things to bring everybody's attention is that landlords are requiring that people have to have 3 times the income for the rent. This creates a problem even when you have 2 people with disabilities that are on SSI or SSA. They're never gonna meet 2 times the rent, let alone 3. So working with landlords, trying to build up those connections, building up that network of people who are willing to take that chance on not meeting the requirements for the rent cost. These are all big issues and big problems that as a community and a support team we need to come together to make happen. Thank you very much for having us here today.
My notes, so it's going to be a little crazy, sorry. Try not to bore you with state speak and blah, 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 bureaucracy, blah, blah, state, blah. So there's something, I learned a lot up here just being on this panel today. And one of the things that really, really struck me, and I think both Margaret, right, Micaela said, is that the importance of getting out of your own community to speak. Mine's Melinda. I am one of maybe a handful of people at the State Department of Housing that knows anything whatsoever about the persons with developmental disabilities and what the housing needs are. And that's because of legislation that came through back in 2010 that required jurisdictions to be analyzing the needs of persons with developmental disabilities in their housing plans, right? So as part of my role at the state is that we have to review those housing plans, and included in that is reviewing those analyses. And so I had to learn a lot very quickly, and quite frankly, it is one of only a very small part of my job. The importance, this is my soapbox part of my discussion, is the importance is education with housing folks, people in the housing community, education at the state level, education for your policymakers, and is incredibly important, because there is not an understanding of what the challenges are and what the needs are and how it varies from other groups and the challenges that are being faced with every day. We are in a housing crisis, that is very true. From everything from people who are chronically homeless, all the way to folks who are middle income, moderate income, who cannot find housing in the Bay Area. And your legislators are being bombarded every single day with all of these issues. So the point can't be made harder that you need to figure out a way to incorporate the issues and what you're trying to address as part of those larger conversations. We just had a big housing conference, Housing California, and I don't know how many people in the room actually went there. I saw, but again, these are the communities that are building the housing, especially the affordable housing. Right now, on the bad news side of things, because of what happened at the federal level with the new tax system in place, tax credits are about 15% less valuable than they were just a year ago. In fact, TCAC saw about a 50% drop off between 2016 and 2015, or 17 and 16, just on the anticipation of the new tax. And that's our number one way that we find affordable housing. So that's the bad news side of things. Because of that, because they're worth less money, we need more money to fill in that gap, right? And we all know that just building supply is not going to get us all the way there here in California. We cannot just dig ourselves out of the current housing crisis and still meet the needs of this very important population, right? So as you're going out there, as you're doing your advocacy, remember that a lot of it is going to be on education. A lot of it's going to be around, you're going to be educating folks as well as incorporating yourself into the larger housing conversation. So there's like three things I always want to say, push, the only way that you're going to be able to, at the least at the state level, to really kind of move the ball and move the needle forward is to push, engage, and educate. I think that it's very difficult that I'm the only one in policy that knows anything really even remotely about persons with developmental disabilities, and I don't know very much. So that's really, really critical. But that does not mean that we don't want to hear. So the good news is that we got stuff on the horizon. We have some really exciting opportunities on the horizon at the state level. We have SB2 was passed last year. It was part of a larger package of bills that were signed related to housing. There was 15 bills altogether. And that provided a permanent source of funding for housing. This is something that nobody thought who's ever worked in this area we would ever see, ever. Incredibly important. It is a small amount of money, but it's incredibly important. Starting the second year of that funding being available, 70% of that money is going to each and every local jurisdiction, and they get to decide what they want to do with that money. That would be an engagement opportunity, right? Because you need to be at that table to say, local governments, what should we be doing with that money? Should we be investing in permanent supportive housing? Should we be providing rental subsidies? What should we be doing, right? Also, SB3, which is the bond that's going on to the ballot starting or in November, is really critical because it's going to fund a lot of flagship affordable housing programs that have no more money left in them. So one of them is MHPSH, which is the Multifamily Housing Program Supportive Housing Setup, which will provide some funding and some available funding for supportive housing specifically, which I think is also really exciting. Two other things in the funding or in this realm that are being implemented as well that came out of last year is AB 74, which basically is a redesign of the National Housing Trust Fund to provide funding for housing for healthy housing, connecting the Medicare waiver program with actual housing opportunities. So we are currently in the process of designing those programs. Another engagement opportunity. And then also, just recently, this was a small bill, but something that you said, Libby, that I've been hearing a lot, and I can't underscore the importance of this, is a bill that was passed last year requires that all HCD projects allow pets. And, I depend on my cat. It is so critical for self-care and meeting some of those emotional needs. And that is something that was very hard fought and won last year. And so now that at least HCD programs will allow for pets in their housing. So those are some of the major things around the funding that's happening. Also, I talked a little bit about the housing elements and the general plans and what local governments are responsible for. Well, one of the big takeaways of this last year is holding local governments accountable too. So I don't know if you're aware, but in each and every general plan of a local government, they need to have programs and they need to have policies in place specifically to address needs for persons with developmental disabilities, not just persons with disabilities. New laws passed last year put more teeth in these programs in that local governments need to be held accountable for actually implementing those programs. And if they're not, they can come to HCD and then we can help encourage that implementation. Or if they're just not following their housing plan, we can take them to the Attorney General. So, accountability is really critical. All up and down the state, from local government all the way up to the state, holding accountable for the programs and policies that are already in place is something of a theme as well. On the horizon, so another engagement opportunity I want to make sure everybody in this room is aware of is that we're at the state beginning our assessment of impediments as part of our plan to get the federal money. That is due in 2020. We are starting in May of this year to go through the public process to do that assessment of impediments. There was some changes at the federal level, but those changes don't affect the state in terms of how we do that. We're going to be soliciting starting in April, the beginning of April. You'll see it on our website, HCD, for applications for folks to be on our committees, to be on our advisory committees for that assessment of impediments. And what that does is that we have to analyze all the special needs and fair housing around the state, and then how that applies to our programs. So starting in April, you'll see those applications to be on our committee. So I would highly encourage this community to be there, be engaged. Again, it's really important that we speak outside of our own communities. My own experience, I worked with a No Place Like Home program as we were starting to kind of build that up. And what was shocking to me, it shouldn't be that shocking to me, but it was the language barrier and the differences between the homeless advocacy community and the permanent supportive and just housing builder community and the mental health community. And bringing those groups together who were always siloed was very, very difficult because of the language barriers. So, but the more we engaged in that, I think we've gotten to a good place in which we can have those conversations. So that's kind of my soapbox in relationship to engagement in education, and then some of the on a state perspective of what we can do. I kind of like left most of this open for kind of general questions. And so I want to turn it back over to you, and yeah.
That's great. If you guys want to keep the mic on that side, and we'll share.
Fantastic.
Does this one work? Okay. Jordan, do I have time to ask a question down the panel before we open to everybody? So just before we open to the other, I think we touched on it, but it would be great to hear in a sentence from everybody if we could wave a magic wand and have something change tomorrow related to housing for people with intellectual developmental disabilities. What would that be? So I'll give you a minute to think. If you already know, you can. Melinda?
My magic wand would be that all of the communities are coming together in a conversation that is trying to address the needs across the board, across all the special needs groups, and not fight amongst themselves.
Bill?
This is a hard one. I spend all my time, frankly, thinking about how to fulfill the mission of a nonprofit organization, and that includes keeping the lights on at that nonprofit organization. But a question like this makes me step back. I think housing is a human right. I don't think it's possible for people to be all that they can be if their housing needs aren't met. I think we, in hindsight, will judge ourselves very harshly for not, I don't think we have a resource shortage. I think these are political decisions. I think we're a rich country. I think we're a rich state. I think we have enough resources to meet the housing needs of every person who's living on extremely low fixed income and also may have a disability or another challenge that they're facing. So I think we would have we would do better to have a rights-based approach and simply make sure that those resources were allocated where they need to be allocated first.
Awesome. Affordable, accessible housing located where they want. You know. And I guess jumping on that, mine would be that every new housing development, and I know that people don't like requirements and developers will hate me, but I wish we had an inclusionary zoning requirement related to individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities so that every development had to include it. So questions from the audience?
Yes, there is definitely a few here, so we'll look forward to the answers.
First one, how does affordable, accessible work in the state housing plan? And we need to raise the percentage of accessible.
Melinda, that might be for you. Mr. Commissioner.
So I just want to make sure that I understand the question. So can you repeat the question?
The county commission, I'm on a county commission. The DAC has been trying to work with the state to get affordable and accessible to work together. There seems the problem of it is they don't seem to want to work together. Plus, we're concerned about there's only 7%. That's the 88 requirement for housing. How do we raise that percentage? And how do we do that?
No, those, okay, I understand. Thank you. I think that, you know, one of the things that through the advocacy of people in this room as well as other folks has been doing, especially in our tax credit program, has been looking to see how we can raise some of that percentage. It's actually one of the programs and policies that we have in our state housing plan that was finally finalized, is to try to make sure that we have accessible housing in all of our projects. And there is a difference, and this comes in again with the education, between just ADA compliant and fully accessible housing. So to the degree that as we develop, so each program that comes in, it's not, we don't have like this statewide kind of systematic goal of this is how much we want. Each program, as it's being developed, will come in with its own requirements, and through the guideline process, it'll develop those requirements. So one of the things that I just outlined a bunch of brand new engagement opportunities. It's going to be really critical to make sure that that voice and that need is heard as we are developing out these programs.
Thank you. What questions should we
Ask
ask
our local city and county governments about their housing plans, about how their housing plans help those with developmental disabilities.
So the first thing I would ask them is, what are your programs, and what are your programs specifically to engage in this? Look at the housing element part of their general plan, see what they have in there, and then say, how are you doing it? What are you doing in order to implement this program that you have on the books? And hold them accountable for what they say. And not just let it be just another program that's collecting dust.
I would just add one thing to that, which is that when I'm talking to cities and counties as well, we need to be careful that our advocacy is representative of the diversity of our community. So early on in my conversations, I was meeting Mo CD in San Francisco, and they were saying that most of the people that they were hearing from were high net worth parents who had resources and wanted the city to help them, and that's a really confusing discussion. So, and it was generally all white families, and so we need to make sure that also cities and counties who have other issues that they care about around affordability and equity know that our community is a cross-section of incomes, races, backgrounds, all of that.
Absolutely.
And just to piggyback a little bit on that question, is that
City council meetings? I mean, where do you see the advocacy happening at that level?
It would be all of the above. You know, unfortunately, for any layperson, and even for those of us who are so-called experts, you know, housing is federal, state, county, city, private. And so you're going to have to advocate at every level. As far as housing elements, you know, there are specific jurisdictions that have to do a housing element. You can do advocacy with each jurisdiction that does a housing element. But certainly city councils and county supervisors are all critical decision makers for how resources are made available in that local community.
One other area is they're going to the Capitol for the Senate hearings and things like that to give testimony.
For the housing crisis is extremely important. There's one March 15th at 9:30 a.m. See, there you go. This Thursday, 9:30 a.m., we need as many people out there as we can to give testimony. If you are someone who doesn't like to voice your opinion, write it down. Get testimony from the people that you support, from yourself. Get as many as you can. Have someone bring them. They'll accept it. I mean, the agency I work with, we will all stand there and be passing those letters out one by one by one by one. It makes a huge difference. It really, really does, because we need to bring attention to the housing crisis. That's one of the big things. Libby has made it a point to where she's going to start attending the city council meetings every so often, just to keep it in mind with Mayor Steinberg that, hey, I'm here and I'm not going to stop. So please spread the word about the 15th. We would greatly appreciate that.
My next question is, housing is independent throughout the state. For example, LA and Sacra have two different adaptive issues. Is there a plan to address this issue?
Bill, I'm sure you can speak to this too. I'll just mention that I do think what
Bill mentioned around the Landryman Housing Alliance, and actually really trying to do just that, to recognize that, yes, there are different issues across the state, but the work that LHA is doing, and Chris McCann, I'll put her on the spot, you can ask her more, and I think there's going to be some surveys going around after this that Jordan will mention, but trying to create a statewide framework so that while you need to do local advocacy, we do have some general common themes that can be applied to jurisdictions and used in toolkit form or advocacy tools across different areas.
Great.
I'm going to invite Chris to explain real fast. The State Council of Developmental Disabilities, you heard from Aaron Carruthers, the director, yesterday. The council gave a big grant, and they said, what is our priority as a state council? They said, we want a statewide plan on housing for our community, and Chris can explain more about it and how you can actually have input and get involved.
Fabulous, thank you. I'm here as a mom. I'm here as the director of Bay Area Housing Corporation, and I do sort of what Bill does down in the Silicon Valley area. I've been doing housing 20 plus years, and we work very cooperatively, the state housing groups up and down, and we have a group we borrowed from you guys a little bit after coming and listening to how successful you were, the Lanterman Housing Alliance. And we wrote a grant, and we got it through the state council, because we need to know what people have for housing right now and what do they want. So we need information, and we were lucky enough to get this grant. So now we're asking stakeholders, and you all are stakeholders, to tell us what people currently have and what do they want. So then we can go address new funding opportunities, talk with the state, get out there and not be in our silos. So here's your chance. If you want to give input, the survey is being done right now. We've hired the Corporation for Supportive Housing to help us do this. This is a big federal thing, and this is really exciting. So if you get out your phones, right now, get your phones. Everybody has a phone.
It's rare when somebody asks you to
Get
pick
out
the
your
phone
phones and look at that, and go to your search engine and go to Lanterman Housing Alliance. If you do that, and there will be a place on there in the menu where it says statewide strategic framework. You scroll down, put in your name. So as soon as that survey comes out, you'll get a copy of it. And we need, especially to get consumers to be able to give input. So if you are a part of an organization, get this out to folks, because it's only going to be as good as getting his input from people about what's going on. So again, it's just LantermanHousingAlliance.com, basically, and you'll get it. Go to the menu, scroll all the way down, and it will say a statewide strategic framework. And we hope next year at this conference we can come back and tell you what people are saying and what kind of strategies and funding do we do to work together to get more exciting things going on. And my card's back there if you need more, but it's a wonderful first step, or second step, or third step, but it's never enough steps. So thank you.
Just little process note there. It's .org. .org. We'd love to be a .com, but we're not. We're not.
So we have a whole stack of questions here, but I've been told we just have a couple minutes. What do we have time for? One or two more questions? Okay. Next one. How can I become more involved in advocating for housing for IDD at my local government?
I feel like we kind of answered that.
Am I on here? There we go. Well, we hit on some things already. Your county supervisors, your city councilors, your mayor are all important decision makers in how housing housing policy is set, how affordable housing resources are allocated, how affordable housing developments get cited or go forward or don't go forward in your community. I will say that in addition to some of the fixed opportunities like a hearing on housing or like a process to update the housing element, all of these elected officials have office hours, and even if you only meet with their staffers, I think it has phone call is better than an email. In person is better than a phone call. If you are present, you make an impression and you let them know that there's an unmet need and that there's a community of others that have the similar unmet need. So there's lots of ways that you can do the local advocacy. You may also have agencies where not elected officials but employees have an important role in how housing happens in your community. It can be the housing authority, which is a branch of the federal government. It could be a community or housing. It could be a mayor's office of housing and community development. It could be a community development organization. They have lots of different names. And all of those organizations need to hear from this community that there's an unmet need and often an unseen hidden need for the housing for people with intellectual disabilities.
Also form partnerships with other housing groups. For example, the YIMBY groups in the Bay Area, with the Nonprofit Housing Association, with other types of developers and housing groups, so that you can rely on each other when you need, like, for example, a development comes forward in front of the city council, that there is a voice. I always say that people who are okay with the development never come to a city council meeting. So, but it's always the people who are not okay, and that's how development gets denied. So be aware of what's being built, form partnerships, form alliances with other housing groups so that your voice can be collectively heard.
I would just add too, on the private sector side, is that there's not just affordable housing developers and public entities, but market rate developers, for-profit investors in real estate. They won't solve this for us alone, but getting them aware of this issue. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in offices of major real estate developers and they're like, nobody's ever said the word disability in my office, but people do say the word homelessness. People do talk about veterans housing. People do talk about other issues. So we also need to make sure those folks with a lot of resources, and whether that's, who knows, down the road they'll include people with developmental disabilities in their developments, or they'll fund these, or they'll be advocates, or they'll reach out about a project opportunity. Those folks need to be aware of our issues as well.
Thank you. I've been officially cut off of time. So what I would like to say is, if your question did not get answered, let me know. I'll put your name on your card and try to find an answer and get back to you. Thank you.
Big round of applause. Thank you, guys. That was fantastic. What a critical need and discussion. And thank you, guys. While the IDD community may be a little later getting into this game compared to some of the other communities that were mentioned, veterans, mental health, homeless, my hope is that we make a real strong comeback right now, and we make sure that as these dollars are being allocated and there are dollars being spent, that we make sure that our community is right there in the mix and at the table. And it's going to take everything. It's going to take Libby Drake going to the mayor's city council meetings every month, and it's going to take you guys doing the same thing at the city level. It's going to take advocates at the state level, and everything I'm hearing is that we are making that difference.